Hi. So in this session, I want to talk about socioeconomic and political structures. I want to talk about ethnicity and race. I even want to get into my personal political views. So let's start off with what I believe. I'm a person that leads with his spirituality, which means that I understand that there isn't really a system on the earth that will 100% ever support what I support. If such a thing were to exist, I'd support it, but there is no current faction, um, especially in my current government. I'm an American, um, that really supports the spirituality that I support, that really supports the values 100%. Um, so the main two parties in America is the Democrats and the Republicans. It's the main two. There's a bunch of other smaller ones sprinkled throughout, but they never really gained any traction to make a difference. But that's the main two parties. There's the red blooded elephant Republicans and the blue blooded donkey Democrats. And they both have some things that I like about them, and there's things that I don't like about them. But I also understand that it's best to say that every election, Democrat and Republican means something different. So the Democrats and the Republicans of the 50s is not the same as the Democrats and Republicans of the early 2000s, nor is that the same as what we're experiencing right now. Those factions change with the times. So even though the title remains the same, the values that those groups stand for and their agendas and things like that, they change, people evolve, people new evil gets elected, new evil gets in power. Um, like for example, Martin Luther King technically was a Republican. That has nothing to do with modern day Republicans because that's a different type of person. So oftentimes I've heard people try to use just events of the past in order to somewhat support what they currently believe in, and I understand that that's very different. Early 2000 Democrats and Republicans are very different from 2020 Democrats and Republicans. They're supposed to be. I expect them to be. Um, because issues change, values change. Now, I personally believe that we would see a lot more growth in America if instead of voting for, let's say, a politician whose views we support, we vote for the values we support, and then the politician has to do what we say regardless. I'd find that much more useful than what we have today, where a politician can get elected because they said they would do X, Y, and Z should they get in office, but once they get in office, they do whatever they want. And a lot of them could even admit and say, I just said that to get elected. If we reversed it, if we, the people, were to reverse that and make it to where um, we elect you just to do what we say, it wouldn't really matter who got elected. Or even if I'd find this more helpful than what we have now. Um, if we had to elect a representative of more than one party and they had to somewhat collaborate on every decision. So if we are going to stick with the we elect the official whose values we sync with the best, we'd have a Democrat and a Republican president, and then they have to come to an agreement on all decisions. I'd find that much more useful than the issues we got going on right now. um, so, like I said, there's no one faction that I can identify with. Um, there's small views, there's small things here and there. There's parts of this, part of that that I support or don't support. And I'll really just chalk it down to this is that the closest that I've found to what I support is within Rawlsianism, and it's the two principles of justice. Number one is that everyone deserves the same rights and liberties. Number two is that inequalities are only justified insofar as they only benefit the most disadvantaged members of society. That's what I believe. Whatever supports that I support for the most part. Aside from my spirituality, that's what I support. I believe that everyone should have the same rights and liberties, no privileges, no mistreatment, no unfair treatment. I believe on that level we should all be getting the same stuff. That one person who robs a bank should get the exact same sentence as someone else who robs a bank, regardless of their of any other factors that we see come in play. Like it's common in America that white people get lighter sentences than black people. Super common. Like in Florida, right? There was a man who drove through a parade drunk and hit a few people and killed a few people. Now, I believe he should have went to jail, absolutely, but they gave him 700 years, which I believe is a bit much. I've never heard of a white person get 700 years. Um, for context, America isn't even 300 years yet. America's not 300 years old, but it's a guy that got 700 years in Florida. Things like that shouldn't really be possible. Then the second part, inequalities are only justified if they benefit the most disadvantaged members of society. Like when the topic of reparations comes about, I do believe that because of the history of black Americans, that black Americans should receive a bit more benefits. And I'm not just saying that because I'm black, but I'm also not going to avoid it because I'm black. Yeah, there's a very blatant history that we have in this country. For one, if you don't know, somehow you might have missed it, but not only were we brought here on slave ships from Africa, but we were actually the natives of this continent before the Europeans got here. So it's not just y'all got here on a boat. We were here first and got our land taken from us by European settlers. So it's a mix of getting stuff taken from you that was already yours and getting mistreated in a land you didn't ask to be in. But most of our issues don't really come from slavery alone, right? Our issues come from the Jim Crow era, more so the decades following the release of the slaves, the freedom of the slaves, the partial abolishment of slavery, because slavery never actually got 100% abolished in our U.S. Constitution. It's still technically legal, and I'm gonna get into that a bit later. Yeah, so black people in this country have a long history of being mistreated by the government. Yeah, that's just the truth about being in America. Now, it's not limited to America, but I'm not in other countries yet, so I can't really speak from or for their perspective. I have heard a few things. For example, when the war in Ukraine first started, saw several videos of black people getting kicked off of trains so that the white civilians could escape. So it's not that racism towards black people only exists in America. It exists other places. There's been certain times. Now, let's just say every race has experienced a certain level of prejudice and harm and mistreatment in America. But it seems as though black people have it especially hard in that it seems like our government is specifically targeting black people. What I mean by target is that people of other groups, people of other racial groups can travel over, migrate over, and they really don't get bothered as much. Meanwhile, those of us who, let's just say, grew up here or born here, find it difficult to do a lot of things that we see migrants do. And this is because we're actually targeted in this country. The FBI and the CIA have both admitted that they 100% did violate the rights of the Black Panther Party when they infiltrated and paid for and sent a spy in to dismantle the Black Panther Party from within and get Fred Hampton killed. All of that is things that have been done by the government towards black people. And it really goes into a topic that I found interesting, which is the difference between race and ethnicity. So let's just say race deals more so towards your genetic makeup. Your ethnicity deals with the type of person that you are within that genetic makeup. So let's just say that in America, all races are accepted, but only certain ethnicities are allowed to succeed. In that there's a certain type of person that you have to be in order to really make it big in this country. And if you notice, you see the same type of people replicated. You see the same type of people struggling. I've said this before. Not sure if I've said it on camera, but just an example of a type of person finding it harder is that in the conversation of introvert versus extrovert, our country, our society is built on on extroversion. A lot of the requirements for working a job are tailored towards extroverts, and that introverts aren't really allowed to be themselves in order to work. We have to really shape ourselves and be more extroverted. But there aren't many jobs that require people to be more introverted. This is an area of unfairness that is very, very popular. Can you smile? Can you talk? Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you move around a lot? Can you be energetic? Can you smile? Can you have can you keep up a lot of energy? Not all verts are created equally. Especially in this society, it's tailored towards the extrovert, which almost makes it seem like in order to be wealthy, in order to really make it in this society as an introvert, you have to pretend to be something you're not. You have to go against your nature, go against how you actually feel and what you really are in order to make it, because what you are, and I'm not talking about social versus versus asocial or antisocial. That's a different conversation. Just introverted versus extroverted. So the same way that we can find some areas of bias between the introverts and the extroverts in society, we can find that same level of prejudice, but even more so aimed at certain ethnicities among several groups. So before I get into that, this is going to lead into it, but let's say you're not Mexican, you have a Mexican friend. You go to your Mexican friend's house and you see a few things. Maybe they all speak in Spanish in their house. Maybe you see Mexican decorations. They might have the Mexican flag in there. They might have some statues to represent their culture. The food that they're eating, if they're eating Mexican food, you go over and visit, that doesn't bother you. You might actually be excited to learn about their culture. You're like, wow, this is how y'all live. It's so different. It doesn't really bother you. You have an Asian friend, let's say Chinese. You go over to their house, they take their shoes off, they speak in their language in their house. They have Chinese decorations everywhere. They have Chinese customs in their house. It doesn't really surprise you. They cook food, it's Chinese food. But it's homemade Chinese food, so it's even better. It doesn't strike you any different. It's almost expected that when you go into their territory and their house that you should see their culture. Now, what I want to get into is that for the most part, when you go into a black person's house, now granted, we're labeled as African American. Very few of us have any African decorations. We don't really speak any African languages. even though we're a mix of, let's just say, African and Native, we don't have any Native American decorations. We don't know any Native American languages. We don't really eat any African food. We don't eat any Native American food, really. Now, why is that? Now, I've heard the conversation on gentrification. I like to just call it colonization. In that we've seen before that whenever like European settlers came over, they would force their culture onto the culture that was already there, onto the people that were already there. Where they, you could find pictures where they take a Native American family and they cut all their hair to make them really look white. Replacing cultures where you're not really allowed to practice your culture. In order to thrive in our society, you have to practice our culture. And this is something that has really hit the Black community heavily, is that we haven't really been allowed to practice our culture for several reasons. Well, for those of us who are already here as a part of the Native American community, because Native American isn't just the what's considered red skin, looks very similar to the Mexicans. That's not the only type of Native American. Native Americans were also, many of them were labeled Negro, in that they were black. Native Americans that were as black as a phone case, as black as my microphone. Native Americans that were that dark. Now, that's intentionally kept out of history because it's a form of suppression and oppression, which is really another form of psychological warfare to convince Black people that our only ancestry is slaves and slavery. Our only history is slavery. So they don't really teach us that we were already here and that they threw the ones of us that were here in dark on the plantations with the ones that they brought over here that were dark. But the same way that the redskin natives were stripped of their culture, the same thing happened to the Negro Native Americans. They were stripped of their culture. The people who were brought over from Africa fresh, they were stripped of their culture, right? And they were forced to really learn white culture. There's a few things that we kept. There's a few things that we created on our own, and we remained our own separate identity. But it really created a different ethnicity. It's an ethnicity of Black people that only know servitude and only know lack. Only know under. They only know oppression. They don't really know what it's like to be at the top because our history was taken from us, in which we were the ones at the top. In the Americas and in Africa, you take royalty, you strip their lineage of any memory of its greatness, and you start them off at the lowest level possible as slaves, where the slightest things, consider it a slap in the face to Black people, where the founding fathers could write such a thing as all men are created equal while they all own slaves. Because we have actually only been considered human in this country for about 80 years. Right? So talk about human rights. We've only been human legally for about 80 years. Because that goes into the mistreatment of people. And there's an episode of The Inner that's coming out soon where we talk about this a bit more, about some more of the psychological tactics used to suppress Black people when they were making slaves. For example, the slave Bible or the Negro Bible. It's an episode of The Inner coming out. But it really takes into account how intentional it's been. So my main topic is really on ethnicity. So what type of ethnicity is allowed in this country when you're dealing with Black people? Like I mentioned earlier, Latinos, Mexicans, they're not actually as bothered as Black people are. They're still very bothered, but they're not as bothered. The Asian community isn't really as bothered as what happens to the Black community. So what we begin to see is ethnicity, right? So again, what kind of ethnicity is okay if you find yourself as a black person in America? Well, I'll tell you who they don't want to see again. Like I said, your race, your skin color, your genetic makeup, they don't mind that. America, think about what America was called. It was supposed to be a melting pot. This is why I don't believe that America has a broken system. I believe that it's working as intended, that it's achieving the results that it was made to achieve. But it's called a melting pot. A melting pot means that everything gets mixed together and everything loses its sense of identity. If it was a salad, that means everything would be together, but everything would maintain its identity. So that alone should tell you what America has always been about. So, what type of ethnicities are not allowed if you find yourself as a black person in America? Well, think about it like this. Who does our government never want to see again? Those are the types of people, those are the ethnicities of people that are not welcome in this country. And they've been working to make sure that they don't show up ever again since they first arrived. So people like Martin Luther King, who he actually was, not who they teach us he was in school, they never want to see Malcolm X again. They don't want to see Marcus Garvey. They don't actually want to see George Washington Carver. They don't want to see those types of people again. They don't want to see Huey P. Newton. They don't want to see Fred Hampton. They don't want to see Bobby Seale. There's certain ethnicities that aren't allowed. Anytime you find a black person that's comfortable in their culture, comfortable in their identity, they're strong-willed, they have an opinion, they have a will, they're willing to fight back. Those ethnicities of black people are not really welcome in this country. Should those rise up, this country is set up in a way to make sure that they're poor and that they have no access. They end up in jail. Whether they're innocent or guilty, our country will find a way to get rid of them, to make sure that they're not replicatable. One of the main ways that they made sure that these figures are not replicatable is by how they're taught, if they're taught in our school systems. For one, they don't teach about Malcolm X. And when they do, they made him out to be some deep, deep radical, and all he did was fight back if you getting hit on. The Black Panther Party was made out to be a terrorist organization when they did talk about him, because they usually don't. When in reality, they were just a response to police brutality, where they were like, okay, they won't protect us, we'll protect us. This is the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Its whole function was for self-defense, because the people who were in that position from the government were and are still abusing their power. So the types of ethnicities that are acceptable are all the people that remind them of slaves. So the people who don't really have a will, people who have an easily broken will, people who don't have too much ambition, people who don't really know themselves, that don't really know their culture, don't really stand for anything, people who don't have a lot of self-worth, people who are comfortable, black people who are comfortable in someone else's culture. Though you'll find those people everywhere. You'll find them in movies, you'll find them in TV shows, you'll find them everywhere. They'll be some of the most successful people. Which is why I say it's not about you being black, it's about what type of ethnic group are you. Will you be a hard worker and still be obedient? Are you controllable? Those things go into play. And that has to be recognized. Not just by black people, but people that aren't black. So that when you notice it, you can help. Because we won't fix any of this country's issues as individuals or alone. It won't take the ethnic group I'm talking about. They won't be able to do it alone. It takes the rest of the ethnic groups. It takes the other races to get involved. Not just to fix black problems, but just to fix America's problems. So you find that, like I mentioned before, slavery was never actually made 100% illegal. It was actually in this past midterm election that several states voted to make it illegal on a state level because it's not actually illegal federally. That's because most people have never read the 13th Amendment. It says that slavery is abolished, it's illegal unless that person is convicted of a crime. If you're a criminal, you're a slave. That's why there's a functioning plantation in Louisiana that is a prison, because slavery isn't illegal. It's just rebranded. So why is it that black people fill up the prisons even though we're, according to statistics, we're the lowest population? It's not because black people commit more crimes than white people. It's because America still wants its slaves. And there are certain things about that. Like, America still wants its slaves. That's number one. And the way to make sure you get away with a lot of heinous activities is to make sure no one actually looks at it. No one pays attention. No one actually cares enough to look. And you make sure the people who do know are so well off, but still controllable, that you can threaten their money should they choose to try to help or choose to try to find themselves in the world. A great example is what happened to Kyrie recently. All he did was share a cover to a movie about Hebrews to Negroes. And he got canceled from the NBA. He had to go out and do a bunch of... They gave him a whole list that he had to fulfill just because he posted a movie cover. He didn't say anything. And the list got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Granted, we as black people been getting called the N-word for free. I've heard it enough. That's a word I don't say. But we've been getting called the N-word for free, yet implying or even hinting at the fact that a black person might be Jewish was enough for him to have to pay several hundred, several thousands of dollars to Jewish people. Black people, for one, we gotta turn up the way these other groups be doing. We keep getting called racial slurs for free. So if we are gonna get called racial slurs, let's make them pay for it, because apparently you can pay for that stuff now. Kyrie had to pay. Kanye had to pay. Whoopi Goldberg had to pay. It's something that happens when you press the Jewish button. But apparently you can do it, say whatever you want to black people, and it literally takes us tearing apart the country for them to do a little bit to fix it. There's not really any protection, especially if you fall within those ethnicities I was talking about. But think about it. Kyrie is rich. He's wealthy. He got a lot going on. They paid not just for black people. They paid for the ethnicity that he was. And the moment he stepped outside of that ethnicity, they reminded him. They made an example out of him that type of black person isn't acceptable. You will be broke. So I'll tell you this now. If you find yourself as a black person in America and you want to stand up for yourself and you want to stand up for others and you want to be a voice for the little guy, you want to speak up for those who are being mistreated, and you want to be strong-willed and fight against oppression, this country is designed to make sure that you're broke and that you don't have resources and you don't have credibility. And should you succeed, they'll wipe you off of the history books to make sure that your story never inspires anyone in the future. That's why we know a little bit about Martin Luther King, because that's a manipulatable story. They're able to tell us that he did everything that he did on his own just by peacefully protesting. In reality, it took the combined efforts of the Black Panther Party Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, several others throughout that time. But it took their combined efforts to get any of the freedoms, any of the rights and liberties that we got today. But it's presented as though Malcolm did it all on his own just by peacefully protesting. I even heard that brought up in 2020 when the riots were going on then. They said Martin Luther King wouldn't stand for this. And I remember Martin Luther King's son was saying he absolutely would. And they were telling him, no, your father stood for this. Now, keep in mind, that's that man's father. He knew him better than the people who got it out of a book. But that's because that's easy to manipulate. If you're going to inspire a group of people who are oppressed and are being mistreated, and you want to somewhat give them a ray of sunshine that can still be controlled, you tell them that their best bet is to do it peacefully, don't disturb anybody, stay within the lines. Hey, y'all pick it within this little area right here. You know, you control it, so that way it doesn't affect anything. You don't tell them about the rest of the story, about how Martin said that riots were the language of the unheard, and that while he himself didn't believe in violent protests, he also didn't tell violent protesters much of anything because he understood that it's the natural reaction that people should have to being mistreated. So even though Malcolm himself didn't really fall into the ethnicity that's acceptable, his story was able to be manipulated so that it can be used to inspire an ethnicity that is accepted in this country. Right? So I understand I fall within that ethnicity. If you notice the things that I do talk about when I do talk about issues in the world and political issues, I don't talk about the mainstream stuff. I talk about things that people really aren't paying attention to. If it has too much traction, I usually don't talk about it because enough people know about it. Because I plan on always being a voice for the unheard. Because I'm not really afraid of anybody. I do understand that this country, America, isn't set up to support people like me. I understand that already. But, dear black people, understand that nothing happened in this country without you. It's not any slight to anybody else. I'm just saying, all of the things that are part of normal society today were invented by black people. We create the future and always have. But understand, so that's some of my political views. That's some of my political stances. Once again, I'll reinforce this just because I like the idea. If we're gonna be electing officials who have views, and we want their views to be pushed on everyone else, we should have more than one of them, so that no one is left in the dark. If we're gonna have presidents done the way we do now, we should have two of them, a Democrat and a Republican. Then they gotta agree on everything. But the better option, which I think is the better option, is to vote not necessarily for the politician, but to vote for the laws themselves. Vote for what we want to be enacted. That's what we want. Like, vote for what we actually want. Vote for the issue itself, the stance on the issue, and then the politicians got to do it regardless. Actually make slavery illegal. That's a great place to start. Make it to where the fullness of a person's ethnicity doesn't get them blacklisted in this country. Doesn't matter. I believe everyone should be able to display their culture. Whatever you are right now, you should be able to display it. Which even goes into the topic of the LGBT. Whether I support that lifestyle or not does not have anything to do with whether I believe they should be being mistreated and blacklisted and they can't work and they can't eat and they get beat on in the streets by conservatives and they get harassed. I don't believe that should be happening to them. Apart from whether I do or do not support their lifestyle. They shouldn't be mistreated. Same with the whole women's right feminism thing. I don't believe women should get paid less just because they're women. I believe they should get paid the same amount if they're doing the same job. Which really goes back to my main two principles. Everyone should have the same rights. Everyone should have the same opportunities. And and inequalities should only be justified if they're benefiting the most disadvantaged people in the society. But we've got to be honest about who the most disadvantaged people in our society are. It's not as simple as think your way out of it. It's not as simple as just band together when you have a predatory government that wants you to stay below. How many times have black people gotten their stuff together and our government has made sure that fell apart? It really seems like, just from a historian standpoint, that the 60s was the last time that you saw black people actually care about themselves en masse. And our government did everything in its power to tear that apart. Releasing drugs and weapons into our neighborhoods so that we can then secretly join them and oppress ourselves. People today still hooked on drugs that were released to mess up the families in black communities. Because it works. The government knows how to oppress people. It was made to oppress people. It was made while oppressing people. And it hasn't really changed. So, yeah, we've got to get honest about another example, the Tulsa Massacre. And that's only one of several massacres that have happened. We've got to get honest about the way that our legal system handles our issues. Not just from black people, but people in general. It's a shame that our government can hide thousands of unused rape kits. Goes to show how much they care about women. It's a shame that our government really gets away with a lot of heinous activities, and we let it because we're too busy fighting about, are you red or are you blue? Are you on the left side of the predatory bird or on the right side? Same beak. Yeah, so it's not as simple. You have to address the fact that this system is set up to oppress certain people. An example, like I said before, LGBT women, they fall outside of the ethnicity that America was set up for. America still wants women who stay at home and don't do anything, and the husband goes out and does everything on his own. That's what America's designed for. That's why it's a fight to get the opposite, because America's designed for that. Why is it that people who aren't heterosexual, like, this is the perfect ethnicity in America. I'll describe it. If you find yourself outside of it, this is why you struggle in this country. The only acceptable person, 100%, is a white man, Republican conservative, that is heterosexual, and that's it. If you fall outside of that by any of those definitions, you find difficulty, because that is the ideal setup to function in this country. So if you find yourself as a Latino man that fits the rest, hey, guess what? You're still an ethnicity that this country doesn't like. You'll find your difficulties. Why does it work for him and not for me? It wasn't designed for you. We have to face reality. A lot of stuff that we see as normal isn't designed to support us. It's not. We can't keep lying to ourselves. Now, I say all this to say it's absolutely possible to fix it. We first have to look at it for what it is. Not even a reformation. We don't need to elect better leaders. Voting won't fix it. Sorry, conservatives. Voting won't fix the problems because voting is part of the problem. You do realize we didn't even get our voting rights by voting. It took acts of Congress, literally, to get us our voting rights. Because when we were allowed to vote, originally we were, what was it? 1/4 of a white man. So it took 4 of us to equal 1 vote. So voting hasn't been the issue. Like I said, we've only been considered human for about 80 years. We've only been human for 80 years in this country, which means all of these things that are labeled as human rights, we're just not getting them. And that's only for black men. Black women are still fighting a lot of these battles, sadly enough. The first black such and such happened a while ago, but the first black woman to do it is still happening. First black female pilot just happened a few years ago. So understand, you're not dealing with the people that are lazy and that don't want to stand up for themselves. You're dealing with the people that are systematically oppressed to believe that they deserve nothing but what is given to them. They deserve the bottom of the bottom, the lowest of the low. They have no identity. They have no culture. And that all of the people who decided to step out of that have consistently been made an example of. You're not dealing with simply just, oh, think about it different. Change your mindset, because that'll work for a few. You have to address the predatory system also. So my main issue in this country is that it's designed to gaslight victims. It's designed to gaslight the oppressed instead of dealing with the oppressors. Someone does something to you, they'll tell you be the bigger person before they tell the person that did it to you to stop doing it. Why in the world have we made a culture on standing up against victims? Where being a victim, being hurt is the weakness, not hurting people as the issue. That's why Christianity hasn't been of any use. Why do we find Islam increasing in the black community? Islam said we ain't standing for that. That's why Malcolm X, that's why you still have black Muslims growing today. It's because they found a system that didn't just say, shut up and take it. You know, the Christians are saying turn the other cheek. The people of Islamic culture are saying fight back. Fight back. And that's a better message. That's a message of hope. Think about the songs that we sing in church. Most of the hymns came from slaves who were begging to die. They were begging to get to heaven because heaven was synonymous with death for them. They knew that the best thing for them would be to die. And they have us singing those songs at church. Open up your hymnal. Find out where a lot of those songs came from. They came from slaves who didn't want to be on the plantation anymore. And you're singing those same songs, invoking that same spirit of oppression over yourself. I've already addressed my stance towards other races. But I expect people to cope how they need to when they hear a lot of this stuff. No, not biting my tongue on a lot of this stuff. Because I understand that not talking about it hasn't fixed the problem. I was having a conversation with someone who will remain nameless because I don't want to embarrass them. But I'll tell you what he said. We were talking about like the race issue in America, and he said, you know, this is a reference he used. He said, you know, they asked Denzel Washington, it was like, what do you think would fix the race issue in America? He said, stop talking about it. And he used that against me. So I asked him in response, I said, so stop talking about it is the solution to that issue. Okay, so would that also be the solution to pedophiles in the family? You know, you just stop talking about it and Eventually, Uncle Rich will just decide he don't want to do that no more, right? Right? No. Because not talking about it protects the shame of the oppressor, the abuser. It doesn't protect victims. It creates more victims. So I'll tell y'all this. Losing your voice and biting your tongue won't help anybody but you. If it helps you at all. Because most people are being eaten alive by the things that they won't say. Afraid of what someone else or how someone else may feel should they choose to be a whistleblower. If you needed encouragement, use this video as proof. Tell on them. You have an abuser? Tell on them. Forget their reputation. They don't need it. They need a new reputation. If they're consistent, if they are an abuser, I'm not talking about someone who just made a mistake. I'm talking about someone who's practicing abuse. They're not trying to stop. It wasn't an accident. This is what they do. They need to be told on. That's the reputation they need to have. If they abuse women, if they abuse kids, if they racist, if they're this, if they're that, they need to be told on. That needs to be their new reputation. If their world falls down around them, that's not their fault. That's not your fault. That's their fault. But I will say we'll never fix any problems by not talking about it. It's amazing that when it comes to things that we want to see, we're taught you have to speak things into existence. But when it comes to things that make certain people uncomfortable, we're told don't talk about it. You're focusing on it too much. And while that can be true to a certain extent, there's not a problem that got solved because people didn't talk about it. Who knew all this time if we wanted our voting rights, before we were able to talk, before we were able to do anything in this country, we should have just shut up. Eventually, Massa would have gave us our freedom. We wanted it too bad. We shouldn't have thought about it. We should have just not said anything, and Massa, out of the kindness of his heart, God would have moved on him, and he would have been released. But that's the problem that's why you see so many people breaking away from Christianity. They found that it is unresponsive to their actual problems. Highly unresponsive. When people need progress, that's not gonna fly. Sadly, it makes God look bad, but that's what happens when the largest religion in the world that people turn to because they believe it has the answer is telling them don't solve your problems, just accept them. Matter of fact, you're wrong for being offended by it. Why are you hurt? The problem's wrong with you. When the people who are supposed to be presenting God to you are also gaslighting you, what hope do you have at a better future? So I'll use the Bible. Let every man examine himself. Have you participated in gaslighting someone who needed encouragement? Someone who may have needed your help to help them stand up for themselves? Did you gaslight them instead of helping them? If you do, examine yourself. God don't like that stuff. But that'll be it for this video. This is already pretty long. So that'll be it. Let's talk about it in the comment section. Let's talk about it on Discord. Links in the description. Bye.